Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Navis Nobilite. And today we are doing a pretty long video, but a pretty important one. This is going to be the first in a number of videos that are encompassing a very complex topic in Battlefleet Gothic. That is deployment and how important it is for playing a strong competitive game against an opponent. I've seen a lot of cases where people don't quite understand the actual importance of deployment. They think this is a little like 40K, where movement across the table is a little bit easier. In 40K, you don't have to worry about the same problems as BFG. So we are going to go over all of the fleets. We're not going to go too deep in the weeds, like there's going to be one Imperial Navy, one Chaos, and then one Eldar, one Dark Eldar. Basically, if there is a fleet with a normal dynamic that encompasses all of their sister fleets, we're just going to do one of those. There will be another video based upon deployment against an already deployed enemy to give you some idea of how to react to an enemy's deployment, common mistakes, stuff like that. But today we're just going to go over the basics of every fleet, which is still going to be pretty complicated because we're going really deep into the weeds about how these ships are meant to be used. So we're starting here today with the Imperial Navy. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, I've mentioned that the Imperial Navy is very much a forward-facing, aggressive fleet. They are meant to form a line and move across the board as not necessarily quickly, but as methodically as possible. You are meant to move forward, fire special weapons, move forward, fire special weapons, and when the enemy finally gets in range, you start chewing them up in broadside combat. Now, there is a couple of exceptions to this rule, namely what goes in the rear line, what goes on the flanking line. I'll describe it all here in a moment. So, as you can see here, I have a pretty bog standard Imperial Navy fleet. I have an Emperor, a couple of Dictators, two Lunars, an Overlord, some Endeavors, a Dauntless, and three Escorts. And this pretty much spans the classes of use when it comes to ships and their function. There are, of course, more ships. There's some nuance here, but I'm being very broad. I also want you to go and try these things and start learning how to do it yourself. So I'm not going to give you everything. This is just the basics. Now, in the Imperial deployment, you should be considering three elements: your front line, your rear line, and your flanking line. The front line are the ships that are designed to go in and brawl with enemies at close range every round. They may not be going full speed because they're firing torpedoes every round, trying to prevent the enemy from having a cohesive front to actually disrupt your formation. So these are ships like the Gothic. This is the Dictator Carrier. This is the Lunar. This is the Tyrant if you're not taking a Nova Cannon. The purpose of those ships is to move forward, break up the enemy lines with torpedo salvos, and then break them very literally the moment they move into range. Now, the Dictator Carrier is a very important element here. Carriers are widely regarded in BFG as rear line fighters. The Dictator is not. It is a frontline fighter. It has torpedoes, it has short-range firepower, and it has fighters and bombers, and those are really meant to support your other frontline units. So it is meant to move with your Lunars, with your Gothics, with your Tyrants, and provide them either direct, bomber support to take out enemy ships or to protect them against incoming enemy assault boats, bombers, and torpedoes. They are essential on the front line. If you put a Dictator in the rear, you're going to find that it's not doing its job very well. And because it reloads both fighters, bombers, and torpedoes off the same roll, you really do want them like solidly in the front so they can keep firing those torpedoes every round. So a good, strong front line. Now, I usually squadron my standard cruisers in like pairs of two. The Gothic can really pair with almost anything. It's really good with the Lunar. It's really good with the Tyrant. It's really good with the Dictator. It's also good with another one of itself. So, but as you can see, a good, strong front formation. There's really no way to approach this formation and cause it to be disrupted unless you have something else to break up the formation. You want to give them just a tiny bit of space between one another so they can maneuver and so they can move at different speeds so their torpedoes can fire at appropriate rates. So let's assume that I get the first turn and I move my dictators ahead by 10, and then I move my lunars ahead by 20, and then we need to turn in. We can fire our torpedoes unencumbered from one another at a single target, if that makes any sense. If I had moved them only 10, let's see if I can get it back. There we go. I can still fire it, but I still have a lot of limitations on how and where I can fire because my dictators are in the way. This is what I'm trying to avoid, but that tight formation is very, very hard for an enemy to crack. Now, we're moving on to other elements of the front line that are a little more specialized. These are the Endeavor. These are a pair of Endeavors. This applies to the Endeavor and the Endurance. The Endeavor and Endurance light cruisers are either best served in squadrons of up to 4 with themselves, or squadroning them with a larger cruiser to serve as effectively a firepower amplifier and a meat shield. Endeavors and Endurances really do need to be put in the front line, maybe off to the side, never in the center though, because they're kind of a strange combined small scale flanker or distraction carnifex or something that your enemy is going to underestimate and ignore in favor of something else, only to find that a pair of Endeavors have a heck of a lot of firepower behind them. So that's for the Endeavor. Now we're talking about the rear line. The rear line is for any Imperial ship that functions through the 45 centimeter to 60 centimeter range band. This includes your Mars, your Armageddon, your Overlord, all of your battleships, with the exception of possibly the Retribution battleship, which is capable of frontline combat. It's not great at it, but it's not bad at it. It's really shining as a fire support battleship. This is also the Vengeance Grand Cruiser. But these ships are designed to effectively utilize super long-range firepower and remain in the rear of the fleet. So I'm going to move my guys back to where they were. I would deploy my Emperor roughly right here. It is, with this movement, remember my battleships are slower. They're still able to provide support with their 60 centimeter range weapons. They're able to launch their fighters in order to help support the front line, along with my dictators. They're able to effectively, wherever my cruisers go, I will be able to support them with the battleship. I do not want my rear line to move in to close combat. Now, if I have overlords, I have one right here. The Overlord is a little bit different. It does have prow torpedoes, which does give you the push to come closer to the enemy. The real firepower of the Overlord or the Armageddon is all in its broadside. So if you can have your Overlord in the rear coming in at an angle, if the scenario permits it, okay, that is better because it can easily, in a round where there's an opportune shooting solution, it can move in, turn immediately, and suddenly expose the enemy to its broadside fire. This is identical to the Armageddon, in effect. Now, the Armageddon is slightly shorter range weapons. They're both very effective. Your Armageddon will need to get closer. But again, moving in at an angle for your battle cruiser, your combat battle cruisers, not your artillery battle cruisers, is about as good as you can get. Now, when it comes to artillery battle cruiser, let's say that, or cruiser, say you have a Dominator, a Nova Cannon Lunar, a Nova Cannon Tyrant, or a Mars. These things really belong, and I'm actually going to pull out a ship for that. Hold on a second. Battle cruiser. I'm going to pull out our Mars. So a Mars or anything with a Nova Cannon should be offset from the fleet in the direction of the enemy, again, at an angle. So I would have them in this deployment zone here. This gives me an excellent zone of fire for the Nova Cannon. I have long-range firepower already. This is why the Mars is my favorite Nova Cannon platform, because at 60 centimeters, I am able to hit them with lances and hit them with a Nova Cannon and launch fighters and bombers. The Nova Cannon should be always offset at an angle, moving towards the enemy from the rear line as slowly as possible. You want the maximum number of templates on the enemy. You really want to avoid rushing Nova Cannon things right up to get advantage of the 1d6 scatter. You are reducing the number of opportunities to cause damage. Remember, even on a scattered ice, it's a 2 in 6 opportunity. It's a 1 in 3 chance of direct hit. You want the maximum number of impacts from those Nova cannons. Now, on to what is called the flank line. The flank line is where you are placing anything that is fast enough to move beyond and around your fleet and can basically turn at a 90-degree angle. So we're talking your Dauntless-like cruisers and all of your escorts. These guys should be playing off to the side, a little bit further from the core of the fleet, to provide a distraction or an incentive for the enemy to deploy ships where you want them. They are too powerful to be ignored, especially if your enemy is skilled. They understand the power of the Dauntless. They understand the power of the Firestorm and the Sword and the Cobra. They can't ignore them, but it means that they're going to be distracted from the rest of your fleet. Okay? The flank line is capable of moving in and around, so even if it seems like these guys are isolated, these Firestorms can immediately turn and rejoin the fleet. The Dauntless, while it can't turn as quickly, can still move 10 and then move. Actually, that was moving 5. Give me a second. Proper movement, sir. Move 10 and then immediately move 15. Congratulations, I'm back with the rest of my fleet. I have fleet cohesion again, and the enemy is frustrated because anything that was deployed down here on their side of the board is now facing the entirety of my fleet coming at them at an angle. Even if the planet is in the way, it cannot save them forever. The longer I can keep my enemy away from me while I drop torpedoes into their space and Nova cannons and bombers, the better. And eventually, when the enemy is softened up from Nova cannons and torpedoes, I'll be able to fight them in close combat and likely win the game. Remember, strong, firm cohesion. The ships are not too isolated. Even Nova cannons are not too far away. I do not want to have them all the way over here. I want them in a nice cohesive pattern, because if they are suddenly attacked through these asteroid fields, I will be able to move in and support with the front line. Also, moving in at these angles means they are moving towards the center of engagement that I am trying to achieve. Notice how this is. Please don't pay attention to these endeavors. Let me turn them around because they're frontline fighters. Notice how this is all directing towards a center point that is effectively where the enemy is. It's broad, it's vague, but if the enemy is here, this will be pointing towards them. If the enemy's over here, this would be shifted over, pointing directly towards them. It does not serve the Imperial Navy well to try to play the circling game. We're too slow. You want to be directed at your enemy as directly at your enemy as you can, and you want to simply make your enemy's life stressful by filling the board with your torpedoes and Nova cannons. All right, that's all for the Imperial Navy. Let's move on to Chaos. Now, Chaos is quite different than Imperial Navy, and these are all going to be pretty different, so please bear with me. I'm making sure that my ships look good so you can actually see them. Grand Cruiser. Now I'm putting in, again, a broad array of ships because they all deploy differently. So we're going to have Murder and a Murder and a Hades. Hades. Cruiser Devastation. Duke. And let's go get some escorts. Okay. So unlike the Imperial Navy, Chaos tends to function very well outside and inside of squadroning. So you have examples. Oh, we need one more kind of cruiser because they're weird. The Slaughter. Okay. So ships like the Slaughter, ships like the Carnage, they generally do not function as well in squadrons, though they do tend to do well. They don't need to. Their firepower is so great that it's ultimately unnecessary. Okay? It's not just a matter of overkill. By squadroning them, you're reducing your flexibility in the fleet because you are faster than the Imperial Navy and many other fleets. The ability to move quickly and effectively and tactically as Chaos is very important. Your movements are also a lot more fluid and a lot less stodgy. You're going to be moving in and out and swarming in a lot of ways that other fleets simply cannot compete with. So your ships are highly specialized, and they're specialized in forward assault, They are specialized in long-range carriers. You are specialized in Grand Cruiser micro battleships, which is what all the Chaos Grand Cruisers really are. And then you have your more support role battleships. So you start with the forward assault ships. So we were talking about our Murder, Hades, and our Slaughters. Murders and Hades all function effectively the same way. Okay? They are the same ship. One of them just has two extra 60-centimeter lances. They are meant to be pointed towards a target, not the enemy fleet, a target, and thrown at them like the world's angriest lawn dart. So you're going to be moving at them aggressively because there's no space around this trio that is not dangerous between 45 and 60. It is a vicious little combo. You want them right up at the 20-centimeter line because you want those lances on target for as long as you can. Once you're on range, then you slow down to your minimum and keep shooting with those lances. You're not really aiming to get super close, though this is not a happy formation to be close to. When it comes to slaughters, they're very different. They're not going to be in a squadron generally. You can, but you don't need to. You put them, again, now these guys are a little like the Imperial Navy in a sense. These can be just sent forward towards the enemy formation. They are cheap, they are reasonably expendable, but they're also very fast. They are going to fly ahead of your fleet, and they're going to be disruptive. Their presence near an enemy formation is terrifying. They have incredible firepower at close range. So while these guys are right up front, probably going all ahead full the first round, getting right in the enemy's grill, the Murders and Hades are going to be coming in and utilizing their super long-range firepower to really disrupt the enemy. Now, there's an alternative to this, which is what I like to call the Dev-Dev Acheron combo, or the Dev-Dev Acheron, which to me is actually a little more effective, because Chaos Carriers in the cruiser line, okay, are not aggressive. They're actually passive fire support carriers, because that prow weapon on the Devastation is only 30 centimeters. However, those two lances are 60. So your Devastations, typically you have two, or you have a Devastation and a Styx. Doesn't make that much of a difference. Yes, the Styx fires at 60, but that is not really, it's really not heavy enough of the firepower to actually be effective. Here, hold on a second. Let me change this thing's layout. There we go. So I typically place my Devastations offset from the forward assault at an angle, usually squadron together, because it's always better to combine that kind of weak firepower that they have. And if I have Acherons, I'm going to put them right next to them or right behind them, because their firepower is very similar. So when these guys move into the engagement, while these guys move forward, I can break them across the center of the table and start shooting with 60-centimeter lances, which, because they're now a beam to the enemy, it's much harder to kill them. So that's the two, as you can see, this is forming into groups. You have the murder group, you have your slaughter group, you have your carnage group. Carnages, like the, carnages, again, are like the slaughter. They really don't need a squadron mate, but I would actually have your carnages, like the Devastations and the Acherons, moving in at an angle. Okay, because the goal is to move in and swing to the broadside, so you can just send that strength 16 weapons battery right into somebody's face. Because if you're going straight at a target, it's hard to get into an appropriate angle to really cross that T. Okay. Now, when we move into the other forms of ships, like your grand cruisers, like your battleships, and like your escorts, we don't have light cruisers to work with. When it comes to your grand cruisers, okay, all of your grand cruisers are slower than your base fleet. So what you need to do to really make them effective is you have to actually have them kind of centrally placed and right up against the deployment zone. Okay. Now, these guys are going to move slower, so the rest of your fleet's going to pass them. By the time the rest of your fleet have engaged, your grand cruisers should be moving in to fire their long-range weapons. It's an unfortunate truth that repulsives are a little too slow for the Chaos fleet, but when they get into firepower range, they really start cleaning up. And this is why you should always buy the range upgrade and the shield upgrade for the repulsive. But it's also the same for the executor. It's also the same for the retaliator. Retaliator's a little different. It's a little bit faster with that 5d6 all ahead full, but you're going to want them basically up front in the thick of it, and either they're distracting the enemy by absorbing firepower, or the enemy is ignoring them, and then they're going to regret that later in the game as they move to clean up what your standard cruisers have done. Now, when it comes to your battleships, you have two general classes of battleship with some kind of mix. You have your fast-moving anti-cruiser battleship, basically focused on the torpedo and the weapons, and then you have your carrier versions. This basically encompasses all of the carriers, not the planet killer. The planet killer is easy. Point towards enemy at an angle and keep shooting until the enemy's dead. But when it comes to your despoiler variants, that includes Scion Prospero, that includes the Terminus Est, that includes the Chaos Battle Barge. All of these things can either be used as a long-range support carrier designed to just dump out assault boats all day, every day, or they can be used as a frontline assault carrier if you give it torpedoes. Imagine a giant dictator. That's basically what the despoiler is. Now, the Desolator has, and all of the variants, so that includes things like the Wage of Sin, that's the Slaughterer, that's the and the normal Desolator, anything that has those prow torpedoes standard and really strong weapons port and starboard, they are designed to move along with your normal frontline groups and assault the enemy directly. So, and usually they're designed, with the exception of the Slaughterer and to an extent, the Wage of Sin, they're really meant to kill smaller ships, so they're really good at killing cruisers and battle cruisers and the equivalent. Going up against a battleship may not have as much luck. Now, when it comes to your escorts, Chaos escorts are either flak, dross, or specialized weapons. Your infidels, they're going to function a lot like, effectively, super cobras. They're a flank line. So if you have, let's say you have a battleship, these guys are going to go right up in front, the carrier a little bit behind. You're going to want your escorts, again, off to the sides. You're going to want them away so they're not going to be interfering or getting in the way of the rest of your fleet, and they're able to move in and attack an enemy at an angle they don't like, namely from the side. If you're using iconoclasts, which is basically, your dross, your super cheap escort option, you can put them pretty much anywhere because they're so fast and so small, the enemy's basically going to ignore them unless they know what kind of damage an iconoclast can actually do. So you can put them way over here and basically move them down around and wait until the engagements happen for them to come and actually start causing damage. When it comes to your infidels, they function like cobras, I mentioned that. Your idolators are a little different. Idolators are long-range escorts. The real best way to handle them is to actually have them move with your carriers and your long-range battleships, slowly moving towards the enemy to take advantage of that really nice 45-centimeter weapons battery, while everything else is already dealing lances left and right. You can have the maximum amount of effectiveness out of those weapons. But yeah, Chaos, it's all about grouping. What group does what and how it does it. Your Murder Hades, your Slaughter grouping, your Slaughter Chaos Mongers, your large heavy ships that serve either as frontline fighters or distractions, and then your carriers, which are all carriers, and your Acherons, which are all long range, a beam firing support, which you'll want to keep the enemy at bay for. So again, all of these, so just to recap, directly towards an enemy target, battleship, carrier group, etc. Slaughters, towards the enemy, you want to cause chaos with them. Your frontline battleship and frontline battleships and your grand cruisers, towards the enemy, but they will go slower. They're either going to distract your enemy's Nova cannons, or the enemy will ignore them and then suffer later. Carriers and Acherons, a beam to the enemy, closing in. Same with the Carnage, a beam, coming in at an angle, a beam to the enemy board, moving in. Both of these want to wait for that opportune moment when they get roughly halfway to the enemy, usually right about here, if I could give a zone, to turn in and face the broadsides against the enemy. So that's chaos. Fun, right? All right, let's clear that up and move on to the next fleet. We're going to move on to Space Marines. Now, Space Marines are going to be pretty quick because it's a very simple fleet. You have your generic Space Marine strike cruiser, you have your battle barge, and you have your escorts. Space Marines are a very aggressive fleet. It really doesn't matter what escorts I use because they all effectively are used the same way. Space Marines are very simple. You want to get close to the enemy as quickly as possible. So you can dump Thunderhawks and dump bombardment cannons. Your battleship, your strike cruiser are all going to be on the front line aimed towards a target. They want to board a thing. So pick a ship, right? Pick a ship. Do not pick a direction. Pick a ship. Also, keep them reasonably coherent. They are still Imperial Navy, so you want to keep them reasonably close to one another. They don't need to be as close as your Imperial Navy counterparts. You will have a bunch of these little guys, but again, the formation should not basically take you outside of the two center squares. And then directly at an enemy. Your escorts are different. Your escorts are your firepower. You want your escorts in areas that the enemy is going to have problems dealing with. So if you have, say, this formation with your strike cruisers and your battle barge, okay? Let me get that going. Your escorts, because they are insanely fast, should be over here. Or they should be over here. Okay? Basically, what you're trying to do is force your enemy to deploy their ships far apart to try and counter an incoming escort squadron. If they don't, if they concentrate here, then you can move around as a flank. If they do put ships over here, and suddenly their entire fleet is spread across this table, you can, turn one, just turn your escorts in, and then move back to the rest of your fleet. Because they're so blindingly fast, suddenly the enemy is spread across their board, and you have a strong, firm spearhead to move towards the enemy. This is pretty universal for all Space Marines, including Grey Knights. Grey Knights have it a little different. They have more escorts, but still, pick a target, move to that target, board the target. That's Space Marines, at least for deployment. Okay, Adeptus Mechanicus. Adeptus Mechanicus is pretty much just a more elite version of the Imperial Navy, so I really don't need to go into too much detail about that. Next one, Inquisition. Again, that's more thing. So we're going to go into Eldar. Now, Eldar deployment depends on where the sun is, and where your enemies are, and where your terrain is. So in this board, okay, I'm going to pull out a Void Stalker and a cruiser. Now, this is also universal for this is predictably universal for both versions of Eldar, either Craft World or Corsair. What matters to the Eldar is where the sun is. So if the sun is behind you, like up here, up at the top, or down at the bottom, it matters a little less than it would be if it was on the side, here and here, because you're effectively, if it's above or below, you'll be zigzagging across the board. If it's to your side, you're going to be moving back and forward. But what really matters for Eldar deployment is where are the terrain features of the board that can block enemy fire. So we're talking the planet, we're talking the asteroid fields, we're talking to an extent gas clouds. Now, unlike the rest of the fleets of the game, gas clouds are more of a hindrance than they are an advantage. Yes, people suffer from shooting through them, but you can die flying through a gas cloud. You want to avoid that. So, when it comes to Eldar, if the sun is back or front. It also depends on where the enemy is, because you'll want to go in and start harassing them quickly. But your fleet moves a little like a fish, back and forth, back and forth. So you want to be in a position where you can move in to the enemy, to a zone where you can fire, then duck out again in your ordnance phase. So I would, if I were an Eldar player, facing really doesn't matter unless we're going into the elements of movement, which is not the point. It's a zone of advantage. I would place a lot of concentrated forces in this area where the asteroids are. I can fly into those asteroids with incredible ease and use them to my advantage and force my enemy to move into the asteroids to flush me out. It's a rough, time for a lot of my enemies. The planet is also here. The planet is very, very useful as well because I still gain that advantage of the gravity well for turning, and it blocks enemy line of sight. So I could have a detachment of ships both here and over here to gain advantage of the planet. By doing this, I'm forcing the enemy to pick and choose where to go because there's no side of this that isn't a problem. And this, again, is identical between Craft World and Corsair. Um, that's really the long and short of Eldar, which is what is the terrain like? If you have no terrain, where is your enemy? And how can I dance in and out to take out the ships I need to kill? Because it's a very reactive form of deployment. The enemy has to place things down to know where the problem is. Long-range batteries have to die first. Carriers go after that. Things like that. So bear that in mind as an Eldar player. Dark Eldar, little bit different. The Dark Eldar do not suffer from the negative side effects of the they don't suffer from the negative side effects of having the ships made out of tinfoil, and they don't care about the sun. So really the question is, what is your goal with the with the Dark Eldar? Is your purpose to move in and take slaves, then run? Is your purpose to go in and break something, then run? Or do you want to stay for the long haul, break as many things as you can while not dying? Generally speaking, the Dark Eldar are one of the most irritating forces to face because of mimic engines. I can make a full move the first round and the enemy can't shoot me. I get effectively an opportune, perfect moment of railing the enemy in really uncomfortable ways. So really, it's a very point towards enemy and kill. That's really what it is. Again, take advantage of all of the terrain features. You're just as good as your Eldar brethren in these, and you have none of the negatives. Okay? So point at an enemy, go towards enemy, do terrible things to the enemy, and move on. All right, we're going to move on to Necrons. So Necrons are a little bit more nuanced because you have, in effect, highly specialized stuff with some generalist stuff. So you have your escorts, you have your light cruisers, you have your battle cruisers, and of course, ye old tomb ship. So the tomb ship is a giant hammer in space. Its purpose is to go in and kill anything it touches. You'll want that thing to be in front towards the bulk of the enemy fleet. Preferably, if you can, be behind a terrain feature that prevents Nova Cannon shots or anything super long range, like asteroid fields or planets. Hide behind those, move towards the enemy as reasonably as you can without, disrupting your ability to fight and fire. But generally, the purpose of the tomb ship is to get in and be indestructible and kill a lot of shit. Now, what the nuance comes into your cruisers. You have your scythe and you have your shroud. People don't like the shroud because it has 4 hits. People don't realize the purpose of the shroud is not to fight. It is meant to be deployed all the way over here at the edge of the board and sit there and give you +2 leadership while the enemy goes on special orders. It only goes into fight after the enemy has suffered against all of your other stuff, and it's safe for it to fly in and use its strength 10 weapons battery to do the job. Now, the scythe is a situation where you're going to want to have it reasonably close to your cairn, but you want to have it offset because this thing fires port and starboard. It is not a all-around shooter. You want this thing to move in and then be able to turn at the enemy. So if you can have it either offset like this or coming in at an angle. You want this sucker to go in, turn across, and fire its broadsides, or you want it, because it's so dang fast, to be able to move around the edge of the enemy and have it serve as a flanking force and fire at the edges of the enemy formation. Now, your escorts, again, we're going really into the weird zone here. Jackals and dirges are fast. They are too fast. What I like to do, because I am a lunatic, is to have dirges or jackals deployed, in effect, either right along the front edge or behind the tomb ship, kind of far back. Because the first thing that they're going to do is go all ahead full. And given their insane speed, the likelihood of them going all the way to the enemy deployment zone remember they can turn. I'm just using this as an example. Is very likely round one when they are in the enemy deployment zone. Doesn't matter if they can't shoot for shit at that point. They cause so much chaos that the enemy formation has to be disrupted, or it's going to get shot a lot in the next round. So they either have to turn and deal with the escorts, or they're going to ignore them and regret it. So remember, don't put them in a position where all ahead full will fly them off the edge. That's the most important thing for all of your escorts. Okay. Tyranids. Tyranids are going to be a little complicated because obviously you don't have a lot of control over your ships. They need to go in a direction that their table demands of them if should you ever lose your capacity to control them. So obviously the Tyranids are a front-facing assault army, but what they have a lot of are escorts. They have escorts of the yin-yang. They're everywhere. Because you have so many of them, your deployment's going to be a little bit different. Instead of flanking or instead of attempting to utilize a weakness in the enemy lines, your purpose for these escorts is to blanket the board. They should be everywhere across your deployment zone, moving towards the enemy like hungry barracudas. From every direction, your opponent should be sweating bullets. Okay? It's a bad day to be anybody when you're playing as Tyranids because escorts should be just across the deployment zone, coming in at every angle, converging on the opponent. It's a really effective way of giving people a lot of headaches. But it also, remember, you need that 45 zone for synaptic control. So if you have one tomb ship, keep them reasonably in that band. If you have two, separate them out so you can have greater control and then just converge on the enemy. Okay, finally we're on to the Tau. Now, the Tau function pretty similarly between Korvatra and Korovesh. I really only have to describe it with really one ship because they function virtually the same. Tau are very similar to Imperial Navy, only hyper-specialized in tight formations and a phalanx. So let me actually get some ships out here. So I'm going to use these guys. And land cruiser. So your fleet as a Tau fleet should be tight. It should be unified, like the Tau, right? Right. Base to base with its companion, if it's in a squadron, especially those emissaries, they do really well. And just going to set this up to give you an example. Okay. So as you can see, they are all across the back end of the board. And they should stay there as long as possible. Your first special order for the Tau is going to be burn retros. This is between both fleets because your ordnance is not affected by burn retros. So you're launching fighters, bombers, assault boats, torpedo bombers, torpedoes, and you want them to stay there to maximize the distance between you and the enemy, but you do not want to spread them across the board because when the combat is joined, the Tau need to have overlapping fields of fire in order to support one another in combat. The only ships that really can be like deployed on the side as a flanker will be your Wardens, Orcas, or your Nikasar Dows. Okay? Now, Nikasar Dows are a little bit weird. Nikasar Dows are the toughest escort in the game. They have 2 shields. They are hard to kill. They have port and starboard firing weapons. So the 2 places that a Nikasar should be is right out here in front to start drawing enemy fire, or they have to be over here still in formation with the fleet, but because they're slow, they're going to be going at the same rate. You'll need them to be able to move slightly ahead of the fleet so they can move in and make that beautiful broadside. They're strength 3 apiece. 6 of them. 6 of them gives you a strength 18 weapons battery on both sides. If you can find a way to get these guys in an enemy formation in full strength, you will cause unending amounts of havoc because they're so hard to kill. But this is universal between the Tau Korovesh and the Tau Korvatra, a tight formation across the back of the table where you're firing your torpedoes every round you can. Only when the enemy gets close should you be considering things like, do I reload or do I lock on? And generally, reloading will do the most damage, but there are circumstances where lock on is applicable. Okay? Your wardens can go. The problem with wardens is that because they don't have torpedoes and they function so differently than the rest of your ships, they need to not interfere with your torpedoes. So they have to be off to the side so they aren't going to get caught up in the swarms of torpedoes that are going to fly out. So this should at the very least give you an idea of how to deploy with your Tau. All right, everybody. That's this. That's pretty much all of the fleets. I don't think I've missed any of them. Oh, orcs. I forgot about orcs. Goodness. How could I forget about orcs? Because an orc is an orc, of course, of course. Did I forget anything other than orcs? I don't think I did. No, just orcs. Okay, orcs are, again, different. Again, things work differently if you're using the clans list versus the orc wog. But broadly speaking, they all function off of the same tactics. So we should probably bear in mind what we have when we don't. Now, if you have a Orc Hulk, ignore everything, put it on the center of the table, and move it towards the enemy. There's nothing else that really an Orc Hulk should do. If you can get it at an angle moving, that's fine. It means it's easier to maneuver. But it's a giant rock you throw at your enemy. Just get a wrist rocket or a catapult and shoot your opponent with it. That saves time. So you have in the Orc fleet 2 cruisers, the light cruiser, and the battle cruiser. All of them work the same way. You throw them at the enemy as hard as you can and hope they explode when they die. Now, your carriers, your kill cruiser, and your battle cruiser, the hammer, there's a little bit of nuance here and there when it comes to, do I try to keep them alive longer to launch more assault boats and fighter bombers? Broadly speaking, though, the real goal of any of these ships is to get in for a boarding or a ram. So, at least for me, it's right up against the deployment line, ready to go, pointed towards the enemy fleet. Ideally, I also do tend to point them at a ship that I would like to board or ram and try to intercept it. I'm not very good at it because orcs are slow. I would also recommend every kill cruiser, terror ship, or hammer, give it a large base. You want to be able to board, and who cares if they die? They're cheap. Now, your battleships are pretty much all the same. The whole purpose of these things is to go in and smash against things in close combat. Yeah, some of them have better range, but they're all meant to get close and shoot and board. That's all they're meant to do. So put them on the front line. Get them right up in there, ready to go. The only one that does not follow this is Gorbag's Revenge. Gorbag's Revenge is a powerful carrier ship. It also has a lot of torpedoes. So what you want that to do when you have your front line of things, you want to have the Gorbag's Revenge on either side of your formation, still up front, still up close, but on the side, so it'll be able to utilize its torpedoes without shooting through its own guys, which could be funny, but still. You want it to be able to support your boys with fighter bombers, but you don't want it so they'll get in the way of your torpedoes, if that makes any sense. Sorry about the dinging. Adepticon is literally tomorrow. Okay. Now on to the complicated part. Your escorts. Okay, so your escorts are the Onslaught, the Savage, the Ravager, and the Brute. This is a tough thing to talk about because your escorts, with the exception of the Brute and the Ram, and the Brute Ram ship and the Grunt, my apologies, all have 45-degree turns. So they are meant to go up close to the enemy, use their specialized weapons, and hopefully hit something. They're all pretty difficult to use. So the Onslaught, you have to really try to predict your enemy's movement, but when you do so accurately, you can cause more damage than pretty much any other escort option in the game. So the way that I like to use things like the Onslaught, the Savage, and the Ravager, okay, is to have them, again, offset from the rest of the squad of the fleet, further away, coming in at the enemy from an angle. because I need to be able to have a much broader scope of available fire when they meet up in the center of the board and combat really begins to join. So I need to not need to turn these guys too dramatically because the goal for the Savage gunship and the Onslaught is to be able to lock on if I can. All right. You don't want them all the way over here because they're going to be too far away. You want them kind of close to your own formation. So maybe like there. So you can move in and try to predict where the fleets will engage one another directly. If you can predict that accurately and you lock on and get close enough for savages or onslaughts, you will have so much fun. Now, the Ravager attack ship, again, is a little different. So, unlike most escort squadrons, these should not, under any circumstances, be base to base. You cannot combine their torpedo firepower. So they need to be separated enough that they can fire their torpedoes without hitting one another and being able to hit, to be actually effective with their torpedoes, which is very hard. So you're going to be finding yourself with a formation possibly like this, and they're going to be probably really close to the center of the field. Maybe you can move the things around so your other ships can fire torpedoes if they have them, and then you have this giant wall of really stupid torpedoes flying out to hit the enemy. They're it's unfortunately difficult to deal with. They don't have to be base to base, and they're very clumsy, but the sheer volume of torpedoes they can unleash is insane. Now, your brute ram ship is a different beast. It's a proper escort, okay? It actually moves decently, it actually has a 90-degree turn, and has a strength 2 weapons battery. You can either use this as a light gunship to take out Eldar, which is really funny, or you have them, again, moving towards that center zone node of where the combat will be enjoined and prepare for ramming. And if you can manage to lock up an enemy ship in a boarding action, or for whatever reason you find something that's too damn slow, you'll be able to ram and cause a lot of damage, but it takes a lot of practice. So that's Orcs, guys. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all at Adepticon. Come and find me if you can. Have a great day.